Breaking, your soulmate's biggest secret about you was finally revealed. My beloved child, the envelope was already open when you saw it on the kitchen counter. You recognized your own handwriting on the front, but you had never mailed anything to this address. The person you loved was standing near the window with their back to you, holding a single folded page that should have been buried inside a box you had not opened in years. When they finally turned around, they did not look angry. That would have been easier. They looked as though something they had believed about you for a very long time had just become impossible to believe. Where did you get that? Your voice came out quieter than you intended. They looked down at the page. Someone brought it to me. You knew immediately who. Months earlier, during the worst stretch between you, you had left a box of personal things with someone close to both of you. You had been moving too quickly, trying to create distance before another conversation turned into another argument. The box contained old receipts, notebooks, photographs you no longer displayed, and one letter you had written during a night when you thought the relationship was ending. You had never planned for anyone to read it. Especially them. They placed the page on the counter instead of handing it back. You wrote that before I left. It was not a question. You remembered the night perfectly now. Rain against the windows. Their coat thrown over the chair. Your phone lighting up again and again while you ignored it. They had accused you of hiding something, and instead of answering, you had said the sentence that became the beginning of everything that followed. If you already decided who I am, there's nothing I can say. They had taken that as indifference. You had let them. What they never knew was that earlier that same day, you had learned something about their family, something you had no right to expose and no clean way to explain. Someone close to them had come to you privately. They were frightened. A financial mistake had been made, serious enough to create consequences for people your soulmate loved. You had been asked for help, not money exactly, but silence. Time. A chance for the problem to be corrected before it destroyed trust inside the family. You agreed. That decision became the secret you carried badly. You stopped answering certain questions. You became guarded whenever money came up. You canceled plans without explanation because part of your savings had quietly gone toward helping stabilize a situation you had promised not to discuss. From the outside, it looked like deception. Your soulmate noticed every inconsistency. They only misunderstood its direction. At first they thought you were struggling financially and too proud to admit it. Then someone suggested something worse, that perhaps you had been hiding another life, another obligation, another reason you could never fully commit. Instead of confronting you clearly, they began watching for proof. And once people start looking for proof of a fear, ordinary things become evidence. Your refusal to discuss the missing money became suspicious. Your exhaustion became distance. A late-night phone call from their family member became something neither of you explained. By the time they left, both of you were protecting different truths. Now the letter was between you. They tapped one sentence with their finger. You did not need to read it. You knew the line. I can survive being misunderstood by you. I don't know if I can survive becoming the reason you stop trusting your own family. Their face tightened. Who were you protecting? You looked toward the hallway, buying yourself a second you did not need. The promise had already outlived the damage it was supposed to prevent. Before you could answer, their phone buzzed on the counter. They glanced at the screen. The color left their face. It was the family member who had asked you to keep silent. A message preview appeared beneath the name. I told them everything. I should have done it months ago. Please don't blame them for what I asked them to hide. Your soulmate read it twice. Then they looked at you, not with relief, but with something far more difficult. Because the secret was no longer whether you had betrayed them. It was why you had allowed them to believe you had. For several seconds, neither of you moved. The phone remained between you on the counter, its screen dimming until the message disappeared. Your soulmate reached for it, unlocked it, and read the full message without offering you the phone. Their expression changed halfway through. What did you give them? You knew what they meant. Enough to buy them time. How much? That isn't the important part. It is to me. There was an edge in their voice now. Not because they believed you had betrayed them anymore, but because they were beginning to understand how many decisions had been made around them without their knowledge. You told them the amount. They stared at you. It was not everything you had saved, but it was enough to explain the months when you stopped talking about the future. Enough to explain why you canceled the trip you had once planned together and dismissed it with a vague excuse about work. Enough to explain why, when they had asked whether you were having money problems, you had become defensive instead of simply saying no. You let me think you were falling apart. I was trying not to break a promise. To someone in my family. You nodded. They turned away. That was when you understood that being cleared of one accusation did not repair what secrecy had done. You had protected someone they loved, but you had also decided, without asking, that they could not handle the truth. Their phone rang. The same family member. Your soulmate answered and put the call on speaker. The confession came without drama. The financial mistake had begun small, then worsened through panic and attempts to hide it. They had come to you because they believed telling your soulmate would destroy a relationship inside the family. You had agreed to help only after being promised the money would be repaid quickly. It never was. Then came the part you had not known. I told them not to tell you even after I could have fixed it, the voice said. By then I knew you two were fighting about money, and I was ashamed. I kept thinking I'd explain after I paid everything back. Your soulmate looked at you. You felt the old anger return, not toward them, but toward the person on the phone. You knew we were fighting? Silence. Yes. And you said nothing? I was scared. Your soulmate ended the call. No goodbye. They stood there with the phone still in their hand, breathing slowly, until another memory seemed to find them. The restaurant. You knew exactly which night they meant. It had been weeks before the separation. They had reached for your hand across the table and asked whether you still imagined building a life together. You had hesitated because that morning you had received another request for help. They had withdrawn their hand before you answered. Later, in the parking lot, they asked whether there was somebody else. You laughed from disbelief. It was the worst possible response. They remembered it now. You weren't laughing at me. No. You were angry. Yes. At them. You nodded. Their eyes closed briefly. One old wound had just changed shape, but another remained. You still could have told me something. I know. You could have said you were dealing with something you couldn't explain yet. I should have. Instead, you had expected trust without offering enough honesty to support it. They had expected betrayal and interpreted every silence accordingly. Neither of you had asked the right question. Your soulmate picked up the letter again. There's another part. Your stomach tightened. They unfolded the bottom edge of the page. You had forgotten you had folded it that way before putting it into the box. There were several lines beneath the sentence they had shown you earlier. They read silently. Then their eyes stopped. You remembered those words only when you saw their reaction. That night, after writing about protecting their family, you had written something you had never admitted aloud, that their suspicion had hurt you, but part of you had also been using the secret as an excuse not to answer a much harder question about the relationship. They looked up. You wrote that you were already thinking about leaving. The room seemed smaller. Because that sentence had nothing to do with their family. Nothing to do with money. And nothing to do with the promise you had kept. They lowered the letter. Was I wrong about you leaving me, they asked, or was I only wrong about why? You did not answer quickly enough. Their face changed, not dramatically, but in the small way people change when silence gives them an answer they were hoping not to receive. I was thinking about it, you said. They placed the letter down. Before our fights got bad? Yes. That seemed to hurt more than the confession itself. You could have softened it. Months earlier, you probably would have. You would have explained the circumstances until responsibility became difficult to locate. But the letter had already exposed what both of you had spent too long avoiding. You told them about the evening that had first made you consider leaving. It was not one of your worst arguments. That was precisely why they had forgotten it. You had been sitting together after dinner when they received a call from the same family member whose secret you would later protect. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Afterward, your soulmate became distant. You asked what was wrong. Nothing. You asked again. They said they were tired. Then, almost casually, they asked whether you believed people could really depend on you when things became difficult. At the time, the question felt insulting. Now they sat down slowly. I remember. So do I. Their gaze moved toward the phone. And something clicked for them before you had to explain it. That call was about you. You nodded. The family member had been worried about your relationship long before the financial problem surfaced. They had told your soulmate that you seemed private, difficult to read, perhaps too independent to build a stable future with someone. Your soulmate had not repeated those words. Instead, they had carried the doubt home and disguised it as a question. You had recognized the source anyway. What you had not known was how much influence that conversation had gained afterward. Your soulmate rubbed a hand across their forehead. There were other calls. You looked at them. They began describing conversations you had never heard about. Whenever the two of you struggled, that same relative became the person they called. Nothing explicitly cruel was said about you. That would have been easier to recognize. The doubts came dressed as concern. Are you sure they trust you? Why are they so secretive? Why do you always have to guess what they're thinking? Your soulmate had listened because some of it matched what they were already experiencing. Then the financial problem began. The person quietly warning them that you might be hiding something was the same person asking you to hide something from them. Neither of you had known both sides. Your soulmate stood abruptly and reached for the phone. Don't. They looked at you. You just found this out. They let me destroy us while they knew exactly what was happening. And I agreed to keep their secret. That doesn't make it the same. No. But it means this isn't as simple as finding someone to blame. Their hand remained around the phone. Eventually, they put it down. The ordinary detail that had bothered you for months suddenly returned. Every time that family member called during the final weeks of your relationship, your soulmate would walk into another room. You had assumed they were discussing family matters. Sometimes they were discussing you. And every time your soulmate returned more guarded, you became more guarded too. Two people reacting to conversations the other could not hear. The pattern had fed itself. Your soulmate looked at the letter again. Why didn't you leave? The question caught you off guard. You glanced toward the folded page. Because the sentence about leaving had not been the end of what you wrote. You reached for the letter and turned it over. There, on the back, was the part they had not yet read. You had written it after midnight, when the anger had passed. You wrote that leaving would be easier than admitting what frightened you. You had begun measuring their love by whether they trusted you without explanation, while giving them less and less reason to feel secure. You had recognized your own pride before either of you separated. But recognition had not made you brave enough to change. Your soulmate read the final paragraph twice. So you knew. I knew my part. And you still let me walk away. You didn't ask me to stop you. Their eyes lifted sharply. You wanted me to? You almost answered yes. Then you remembered the doorway. Their bag beside their feet. The long silence after they said they could not keep living inside uncertainty. You had wanted them to stay. But you had also wanted them to choose staying without being asked. I wanted you to prove something, you said. Their expression softened, then hardened again with recognition. So did I. The words settled between you. Their phone buzzed once more. This time it was not the family member. It was a photograph sent by someone else close to them. A photograph of a bank transfer receipt. Your name appeared on it. But the amount beside your name was far larger than what you had just admitted giving. Your soulmate turned the screen toward you. I thought you told me everything. You stared at the receipt. I did. And for the first time since they opened the letter, the secret on the counter was no longer yours. The receipt was real. That was the first thing you recognized. The account number matched the one you had used, your name appeared exactly as it should, and the transfer had been made during the same period when you were helping their family member. But the amount was wrong. Not slightly wrong. It showed nearly everything you had saved. Your soulmate studied your face. You've never seen this? Not like this. You took the phone and enlarged the image. At the bottom was a reference number, followed by a second line partly hidden by the screenshot. Then you understood. That isn't one transfer. They moved closer. The image showed a summary of transactions connected to the same repayment arrangement. Your original payment was there, but so were several later transfers moving in the opposite direction. Money had been coming back. Your soulmate called the family member again. This time they answered immediately. The explanation was uncomfortable but simple. After the financial problem had been stabilized, repayments had begun quietly. You had received some of them, but not all. The remaining money had been held because the family member believed returning it directly would force another conversation before they were ready to confess what had happened. Then came the detail neither of you expected. I sent the rest back this morning. Your soulmate frowned. To them? No. Look at the complete receipt. The full image arrived seconds later. Your name was attached to the original transaction history, but the final transfer had gone into the account you and your soulmate had once opened together for the future you were planning. The account you had stopped checking after the separation. Neither of you spoke. Why would you put it there? Your soulmate finally asked. The answer came quietly through the speaker. Because that's where they told me to return it. Your soulmate looked at you. You remembered making that instruction months before everything collapsed. At the time, you still believed the crisis would pass, the money would return, and the two of you would eventually use those savings for whatever life you chose together. You had forgotten about it. But the instruction had remained. Your soulmate ended the call more gently this time. For a while, the two of you simply stood beside the counter with the letter, the phone, and the strange evidence of plans made by people who no longer knew what they were to each other. Then they laughed once. Not because anything was funny. We spent months believing opposite versions of the same story. You leaned against the counter. We helped. They looked at you. There was no accusation in that look anymore. Only recognition. They had allowed someone else's doubts to become louder than their own experience of you. You had responded by withholding more, almost daring them to trust you without giving them the honesty trust requires. Their relative had made the original situation worse through fear and shame. But the final damage had required participation from all three of you. Your soulmate picked up the letter. I owe you an apology. You do. They almost smiled. So do you. I know. That was the first completely honest exchange either of you had managed all afternoon. They apologized for turning suspicion into certainty. For asking indirect questions instead of the ones that frightened them. For listening to someone else's interpretation of your behavior until they stopped asking what your behavior might actually mean. You apologized for confusing secrecy with loyalty. For deciding what they could handle. For wanting them to prove their love by seeing through walls you had built yourself. Neither apology erased the separation. Neither restored the months between you. And neither of you pretended it did. Eventually, your soulmate asked the question that had been waiting underneath everything else. What happens now? You looked at the old joint account on the phone. Months ago, you might have heard that question as an invitation to begin again. Now you understood that neither of you had earned that assumption. I think we stop deciding the ending before we have the conversation. They nodded. So you talked. Not about destiny. Not about whether you belong together. Not about whether one afternoon of truth could repair months of distrust. You talked about what would have to change if you ever tried again. And what would have to change even if you didn't. When they finally prepared to leave, they folded the letter carefully and offered it back. You shook your head. Keep it. Why? Because I don't need it to speak for me anymore. They held your gaze for a moment, then slipped it into their coat. At the doorway, they did not promise to return. You did not ask them to. But this time, neither silence was being used as a test. The greatest secret had never been the money, the family member, or even the thought of leaving. It was that beneath all your silence, you had wanted a future with them while being too afraid to ask for it honestly. And beneath all their suspicion, they had wanted the same thing while being too afraid to trust what they could not understand. Whatever happened after that doorway would have to be chosen in the open. And if this story stayed with you because some silences in your own life still need honest words, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.